Awesome. I think Dr. Mohammed we'll still need to wait for him to be ready, but let me just start the introduction of Kumi. So to introduce myself, my name is Tan. I'm a project coordinator at Sabil, and thank you for joining us for our latest Kumi Now online gathering. If you're new here, I've put in some links in the chat to learn more about Kumi Now or Sabil. And so we've provided those links, and I'll provide it again for people who are now joining. And for the layout of this, the first part of our meeting will be dedicated to our guest, but please stay around after he leaves, as we will be dedicating the rest of the hour into turning our knowledge into action as we engage in advocacy for Palestine. And before we start, I'd like to remind you that this meeting is being recorded, so please make sure that your mics are off during our guest's presentation. That said, I will be collecting questions in the Q&A portion of the chat, so feel free to write your questions while the presentation is occurring, and then I'll ask those questions once we have the Q&A. So to introduce our speaker, we have today joining us Dr. Mohammed Abdo, and he will be speaking today on the topic of right of return. Dr. Mohammed Abdo is a North African Egyptian Muslim anarchist activist scholar. In spring 2024, he was the honorary or capita visiting assistant professor at Columbia University Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies program at the Middle East Institute. Before that, he was a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell University's Ain Nadi Center's Racial Justice program and an assistant professor of sociology at the American University of Cairo. His 20 years of activist research and experience centers on Palestinian, Indigenous, Black, and people of color liberation, and draws on the Indigenous Zapatista movement in Chiapas, Mexico, as well as his participation in the Egyptian uprisings of 2011. So Dr. Mohammed, it's a pleasure and honor to have you here with us today, and we really look forward to hearing you and hearing the topic of right of return.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most merciful, most gracious. And Muslims always open every chapter in the Quran with the following verse. It is a standard verse. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, shalom alakhayim, perhaps to our Jewish siblings who may be in attendance. I usually start any conversation or talk that I give with a prayer. Specifically Moses' prayer in the Quran when he was about to meet Pharaoh, accompanied by his brother Aaron. I'll say the prayer first in Arabic, and then I'll translate it into English. Allahumma shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. O Creator, Allahumma shrah li sadri, O Creator, open thy breasts and make my affairs easy. وَاحْلُلْ عُقْدَةً مِنْ لِسَانِي يَفْقَهُوا قَوْلِي, and undo the knot on my tongue, such that what it is that I have to share with all of you today reaches your hearts, your minds, and inspires, God willing, change, action. I'm very honored and humbled to be invited by Kumi, as well as by Sabil. Today is day 425 of an ongoing live-streamed genocide on devices that we all use, that we all bear witness to a Holocaust that is unfolding before our very eyes. But the devices that we also use, our cell phones, otherwise, are also a product of another genocide in the Congo, because our phones are made of copper and cobalt. So the intersection of various different myriad struggles becomes very crucial. 425 days. But not only that, 533 years of an ongoing genocide. Let me insist that this genocide is ongoing. Where? On Turtle Island, the so-called US and so-called Canada. 533 years. And this is going to become very crucial for what it is that ostensibly I have to share with you all in a few minutes. But first, I'm currently in Egypt, in Cairo, where I was born. I just recently left Turtle Island And I lived on Lenni-Lenape territory, or what was known as Lenni-Lenape territory, you see, because land acknowledgements are not land acknowledgements or just land acknowledgements. They're about intent, purpose, and action. It's not a matter of superficially paying homage to which territory one lives on. It requires the knowledge of treaties that actually allowed migrants, settlers, of all different creeds, religious, gender, racial, to actually reside on Turtle Island. So what are we doing about the ongoing genocide insofar as Turtle Island, given the fact that America is leading this war? A point that, again, I will come to in a bit. Euro-America, more precisely, is leading this war. Israel is but a mere instrument in its hands. And Euro-America obviously serves as the blueprint, the settler colonial blueprint, because it is a religious project built on manifest destiny doctrines of discovery. But again, I'll get to this point in a few minutes. For now, we have 38 million refugees in total and displaced persons since the so-called war on terror. 5 million who were murdered. And I'm going to offer some brief remarks given limitations of time and certain dimensions of this question of the right of return that I'd like to hopefully inspire us all to think about. There's an estimated amount of 917 million Palestinians that are displaced worldwide. At least these are the statistics from 2021, according to Badil, the resource center in Palestine. This includes about 9 million or 8.36 million refugees and approximately 812,000 internally displaced persons, right? UNRWA in Syria, and I will be taking a little bit in Syria, had estimated the number of Palestinians there to be 438,000 that remain there. Remainder Palestinians exist in Jordan. You have about 2 million. Jordan isn't really, again, Sykes-Picot, most of the Jordanian population is certainly Palestinian. But nonetheless, a little bit over 2 million in Jordan. We have 1 million, probably 2 million in the Gaza Strip. Looking at certain statistics, maybe a little bit outdated. We have about 774,000 in the West Bank. I noted Syria, as well as almost 500,000 in the context of Lebanon. Of course, Palestinians are displaced all over the world. The estimated size of the Palestinian population in Egypt ranges between 50,000 to 110,000. We have over half of Syria's population is also displaced, with an estimated 16.7 million people. And this is an estimate from 2024. Refugees, asylum seekers, and so on and so forth. I'm going to approach this question of the right of return. Whose right of return? Because we have Zionists who, according to their Hasbara, as well as Aliyahs, believe that this is their land. They make the desert bloom, if you will. Whose right of return? And a right of return to where? And according to what terms? These are the questions that run in my mind from spiritual, and I emphasize spiritual, as well as ethical, political perspectives. Why does this question become so critical and important? Because while Palestinians are unable to visit even their homelands, while they are terrorized even entering into their homelands, and as we see the unfolding of the genocide in Palestine, our beloved Palestine, but also when one considers the context of Turtle Island that I noted, and so far as even the displacement of indigenous people, given land grabs, given the ongoing genocide of them, given the decimation that they continue to witness, whose land do we stand on and who is entitled to return? This becomes a very important question. You see, 1492 becomes a very significant year in terms of the history of the world. And the consequences of what we're living now, what we're seeing evolve in Syria, where you have people from all kinds of corners of the world involved in all kinds of political Muslim projects. I'm not going to use the term Islamist because that's an Orientalist term. that was incited around the 15th century. And again, this is why 1492 becomes very important. Two things happened in 1492. Muslims and Jews were evicted from Spain. We were persecuted. We were murdered. We were forcibly converted at the hands of Ferdinand and Isabella. This was part of a crusading project. Muslims and Jews were referred to as savages and heathens. Savage being the racial sort of descriptor, heathen being the religious. So we were already cast, if you will, as human animals by Europe that usurped Christianity underneath Constantine and weaponized it as an imperial tool of conquest and war. Because the second thing that happened was Columbus's crusading invasions of the Americas. Columbus was headed off to India, but Columbus was on a crusading mission. He was out to gather resources in order to liberate Jerusalem. And of course, instead of ending up in India, he ended up on the shores of the Caribbean. In Columbus's diaries, he had referred to the weapons of the Taino people as alfanjes. That's the Spanish term for scimitars, which is the weapons that Muslims used against the Crusaders. Later on, Hernan Cortes, another Spanish conquistador, had referred to Aztec women as Moorish women, Aztec temples as mosques. He referred to Montezuma, the Aztec leader, as a sultan. Even the term berdach that is used to describe two-spirit people, two-spirit indigenous people, was originally cast on Muslims or gender non-conforming Muslims, if you will. So how can we not talk religion? Then later on, of course, once you engage in the genocide of indigenous people, as white Christians and the early settlers, if you will, did, after that, you engage in transatlantic slavery. Now, a fifth of our transatlantic siblings were Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula on the west coast of Africa. So again, when we talk about the right of return, the right of Black people to return to their African homelands in a history that is erased and marked with an X. Make no mistake about it, manifest destiny, doctrines of discovery, Protestant conceptualizations of property, Victorian notions of gender sexuality are what animate Euro-American society. And really, most societies nowadays, including the global south, so including even societies as Egypt, that functions according to the French Penal Code. Islam thus became a quintessential and has always been a quintessential other for Euro-America and for Europe. So again, what does it mean insofar as a right of return? What does it mean from a decolonial and an abolitionist perspective for people who have been displaced and now are living in different territories, in different lands that are not theirs, and are abdicating the responsibility towards the lands that they now live on? So for instance, myself, I'm a first generation settler to Turtle Island. I moved there in 1997. I lived 45 minutes away from a Mohawk resort. What are my responsibilities in my displacement, in my refuginess, insofar as the land that I'm on, and insofar as my motherland, Egypt, where I was born? This becomes crucial. And we need to examine this question from various different positionalities that we belong to, while at the same time given or taking into consideration that we've all internalized cultures of whiteness. A lot of Palestinians don't recognize that, well, we're living on, in the context of Turtle Island, that we're living on stolen land. Well, isn't it ironic then that we're living on stolen land while we're calling for the freeing of Palestine? Well, how can we do so when, in a certain sense, as Arabs, as Muslims, as diasporas, we are Zionists on stolen land ourselves? What becomes our responsibility towards indigenous people and making sure they can return to their own homeland that they very much live on and are displaced within? So to me, 1492 becomes a very critical framing, not 1948 and not 1917, because of the cultures of whiteness that we've all internalized: Black, Indigenous, people of color, using even these acronyms that are highly problematic, as if we don't have Black, Indigenous people, as if we don't have Black people of color, and so on and so forth. To me, these are the questions that we need to be asking. To me, the concept of indigeneity because I don't refer to Palestinian people as indigenous. I do refer to them as native people. They are native people of the land. Absolutely, there's no question about it. But the term indigenous becomes more complicated, particularly because of its genealogical emergence within the context of Turtle Island and that particular political understanding of indigenous people. The history of Palestine is very much different. Gaza traditionally is a part of, if you will, is an extension of Rafah in so many ways. And in that way, Palestine straddles, if you will, the North African axis, as well as the remainder of Palestine that straddles the Levant, if you will, the Levantine axis. So the way that we conceive of identity, unfortunately, and nationalist identity within the conceptualization of statist frameworks needs to be revised. Because at the end of the day, if we're talking about the liberation of Palestine, when I ask Palestinians, when I ask non-Palestinians, nobody has an answer. And we could say, well, after we remove the Zionist entity, well, the Zionist entity is never going to remove without us dealing with its mother, its parent, America. That again is leading this war. This is not a war between Muslims and Jews, but rather one that Muslims and Jews were conscripted into, vis-a-vis white supremacist, again, interpretations of Christianity that were then projected onto Islam and the manifestation of conservative Islam, particularly if we're talking about the range, the Muslim Brotherhood, ISIS, Daesh, Al-Qaeda. There's a whole range that exists, a whole spectrum that exists of, if you will, political Muslim thought that is based on the idea that you can't separate Islam from politics. You can't separate any idea, in fact, from its political foundations. Jesus founded a beautiful tradition, beautiful faith, but that has inherently political, ethical, spiritual commitments. His defense of Mary Magdalene, his admonishment insofar as poverty that existed and continues to exist in the days and the times that we live. So Jesus stood for fundamental social justice principles, as with Musa, who stood against Pharaoh, as with Muhammad against the polytheist Arabs in Arabia. So at the end of the day, we were talking about whose right of return, because again, we cannot, Palestinian society, as any society, is not a monolith, and there are various different political trajectories. And I don't believe, actually, in a state solution, not a one or a two state, and I don't believe actually in a Palestinian state either. I believe in what is referred to and what I argue in my work is a no state solution. You see, Arabs, Muslims have different conceptualizations of sovereignty than the nation state model, let alone different economic structures than capitalism. Sadly, we neither understand our past nor are able to project nor enact these principles, these models in the contemporary. There is no will. We have brought into the white man's world that we need state. Well, who will rule this state? Will it be, for instance, Hamas and Islamic Jihad? Well, Hamas has even different jurisprudential perspectives, if you will, than Islamic Jihad. I mean, see, Hamas is capitalist, or it doesn't critique capitalism. Islamic Jihad tends to be more critical of capitalism. But then you have other movements that exist in Palestine, least of which is the PA. So will it be a secular state? And is there such a thing as a secular state? As William Reich had noted, most statist concepts, secularized concepts, are based on religious principles. Or will it be a state that is based on quote-unquote Sharia, which, by the way, is not Islamic law? Sharia is the corpus of all Islamic jurisprudential etiquettes that have existed in Islam from 1,425 years ago. So it's not a static set of rules, but rather one that is dynamic, because it depends on a certain set of ethics of where these, if you will, laws are being applied at any given space, time, in any vicinity. So the question then, because we have Zionists and white supremacists of all kinds, Arab, non-Arab, there are plenty of Arab Zionists, there are plenty of Muslim Zionists, there are Palestinians that are Zionists, there are all kinds of Zionists in this day and age. Is a Palestinian Zionist an Arab Zionist who took over a Palestinian sibling's home? Are they allowed the right of return? This is a question. Who is allowed the right of return? And upon what basis are we then formulating our relationship insofar as return, and particularly the land that we're going to be on? Our relationship to land, because land is also a spiritual subject. She's not an object. Our Mother Earth is what gives us the thamarat, the seeds that grow into vegetables and fruits that nourish, that keep us alive. Non-human life doesn't need us as much as we need them. And if we sit down and talk about the climate catastrophe, environmental change, what Zionists are doing to the very landscape of the land for which they occupy, the same thing as that occurred in America. And we're not going back to 1492. This is the irony. The land has changed. It has been disfigured. The uprooting hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Jaffa orange trees, as well as olive trees, and so on and so forth. Whose land? Who has the right to return? So 1492 becomes very critical, and us addressing, because the problem with the left is their secular animus, particularly in the context of, if you will, Euro-America, that tends to be animated by secular discourse, forgetting that we have examples like Malcolm, we have examples like Martin Luther King, yet we've abandoned the liberationist theological projects that are attached to the spiritual dimension of life. But the right of return, insofar as then spirituality, insofar as a relationship to the divine, insofar as what in Islam is referred to as fitra, because the closest word or muradif that I could find, insofar as an Arabic lexicon, a theological lexicon to indigeneity, is fitra, if you will. And fitra in Islam means the inclination of us to do good, because we are born in the condition of connectivity and to connect not only with community, with land, with life. We're not born, if you will, in the condition of original sin. Activist Jeanette Armstrong notes that through sacred activism and spiritual paths service, indigeneity can become a social ethic, a life practice intent on employing technologies of knowledge to land in local realities and in regenerative capacities, for that to become the guiding force for human envisioning. Indigeneity then is not a racial or an ethnic concept, if you will, nor does it follow from archetypical sort of multicultural UN declarations, articles, and racial definitions of indigenous people. Indigeneity is not practiced in the hallways and corridors that are domesticated within academia or otherwise. It has to be in a relationship to the land that we are on. And this becomes very crucial, not only, again, from an anti-colonial and anti-imperial perspective, but from a decolonial perspective. Because the difference between anti-colonialism and decolonialization is that anti-colonialism celebrates the transfer of power from one group to another. You defeat the Zionist enemy, so now you have established a degree of, if you will, autonomy, hopefully by Palestinians in this case. But equally at the same time, that depends on, again, the models that Palestinians choose to organize the society and this liberatory project according to. Decolonization, though, involves precisely that, rethinking the very terms upon which that organization will take place. So again, when we return to the question of indigeneity, that involves relearning things like hospitality, how to deal with our disagreements amongst one another, something which unfortunately, again, the left has failed to do. We as a humanity, as a species, have failed to do. This is not a matter of playing Indian, as Zainab Ahmad Hadi had noted, insofar as recovering her indigeneity. And that is why I say, when somebody comes to me and tells me they're queer, or they're indigenous, or they're Black, or they're Christian, or Muslim, that means absolutely nothing to me. What are the set of ethical, political, spiritual commitments that define whatever sets of identity you belong to or subscribe to? Because that will determine how the right of return will play out. You're going to be okay, again, with people that have internalized cultures of whiteness in our midst. These are questions and what to do about it. I know it took about 20 or 25 minutes, and I don't want to prolong the conversation too much because I'd rather have, if you will, an aim. Palestinians have right to return. The same thing with Sudanese refugees, the same thing with so many different refugees. My mission and my goal and my work focuses on developing alternative forms of sovereignty in Islam vis-a-vis the concept of the Ummah. Traditionally speaking, the Ummah was a concept that including Muslims and non-Muslims, Zoroastrians, Christians, Sabians, Jews. It was a covenant established by the Medina Charter or Mithaq al-Medina that the Prophet, peace be upon him, founded. Because the Prophet Muhammad did not found an Islamic state. There is no such thing as an Islamic state. Again, the state is a modern, Euro-American political governing structure and order. The Ummah is something else. The state is part of the world of the above. Everybody wants the world of the above. To gain power, Mubarak dies, Assad leaves, Bin Ali flees from Tunis. Now everybody squabbles over power. But what about the world of the below? What about Isa's world? What about Musa's world? Because they were concerned with the world of the below. They weren't concerned with overthrowing the Roman Empire so that they can re-establish a Christendom, if you will, that rules from above. Isa was not interested in that. I mean, Isa would not have been chosen as Isa had he been interested in that. And neither is Musa and neither Muhammad. But rather they belong to the world of the below. The world of the poor, the dispossessed. They live with them. They march with them, they do not dictate to them, and they are not vanguardist in their approach, a problem that I have with Marxist-Leninism. So this is where I find anarchism to offer that political potential, if you will, for a different kind of organizing our worlds. To me, nation states, we need to understand, operate according to a discourse of rights. What I'm talking about insofar as Ummah operates according to a discourse of responsibilities. One doesn't have rights without responsibilities. What are responsibilities towards one another from a relational perspective? And again, in Islam, there's the concept of khulafa. We're all khalafs. We're all caretakers of the land. There is no need for a single ruler. And we have many examples of many societies in which, again, there are horizontal leaderless societies. Of course, it's possible that different people will have different levels of charisma and so on and so forth. But a leader is somebody who's very cognizant of their anti-authoritarian politique, if you will, and puts that into practice. That doesn't want to covet power. The nation state, on the other hand, is organized in a hierarchical, vertical formation, whereby power is crystallized along that axis of the hierarchy. And whoever is above dictates to those that are below. But what happens when we organize our worlds horizontally? What happens when we capture that 18 days of Tahrir, if you remember, of 2011? The problem of 2011, of course, and that leads us to the mess that we are in now, is not that, particularly in the context of Egypt, that people didn't rise up. They did rise up. But they did not have an organizing model to begin to implement. So they started to tear each other apart. And this is why what happened in 2013, insofar as the overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood and everything else occurred. Because again, everybody's squabbling for power. A pharaoh had died. But killing a pharaoh does not kill the pharaoh and God's displaced space and power. It just makes us all demagogues vying for that space and power. The state is not this abstract entity that exists over and above us. Rather, it really socializes us according to power dynamics and asymmetries of power that exist between us along race, along gender, along religion, along all kinds of different dimensions of life. So we act as states all the time in our day-to-day encounter, when we go to the grocery store, when we do whatever it is that we do. Can we conceive of a different way of life? And if colonialism stole anything from people of color, it is our ability to dream dangerously again. I believe in possibilities of a different world. I believe in a world in which all worlds can belong. I fight for that world every single day, so long as there is breath in me. So in that sense, the right of the return, and to conclude, is about fulfilling acts of compassion, of rahmah, of goodness, of ihsan, if you will, and adhering to innate communal bonds and ethical, political, spiritual commitments, not ideology. I'm not talking about ideology here, right? And if there's anything that's been proven, that the facade of international law, the facade of the modern global order does not hold, does not stand. And we need to begin thinking outside the box. This is not our world. The world that we live in is part of the old world, the crusading world that very much continues. And that is the world that we're occupying now. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your patience, for listening. And I'm deeply humbled and honored to have been invited to speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this powerful presentation. I think you're bringing in a lot of this European Christian colonial legacies and specifically colonial modernity into this conversation. I think, like you said, like the imagination of the European Christian defines a lot of our conceptions of history, time, as you said, the nation state, and then also of land. And I think there's a lot of themes that I think people want you to expand on here. And I want to return, maybe the last question I want to think about is imagination. But before we get into the question of imagination, which I think you concluded with, there's some questions of expanding on this idea of indigeneity. And one question I think that kind of consolidates some of these questions is this conversation has implications for Syria and Sudan as well. Which groups have jurisdiction, which groups rule, and the relationship among different Muslim groups and between Muslim and non-Muslim groups, who is indigenous, who gets to be the ruler, who gets to return. And so I think, maybe you can expand a little bit on this meaning of indigeneity and what that discourse currently looks like, what that discourse could be.
Thank you very much. Well, maybe, Palestine, as much as I want to center, because this is about Palestine, and Palestine is our boussole, as we say in Arabic. She is our compass. If we listen to her, without pre-imposing, again, narratives upon her, we really need to listen to Palestine. So, but I want to, having said that, for a moment, maybe just because of the events the last 72 hours, take Syria maybe as an example for the moment. Though, again, we can always draw parallels. Because in the case of Palestine, well, we can sit down and talk about how Black or African Zionists, if you will, are conscripted into Israel's project, although, of course, they're regarded as second and third-rate citizens. Of course, Palestinians are below them, way below them, right? But how they become, this is not their homeland. They're exposed to de-Africanization campaigns. Israel admitted that obviously it sterilized, if you will, Ethiopian women and Black women, Jewish women, Sephardic, who had moved to so-called the Zionist entity. Where they completely end up. But these are part of the questions that we need, because they're now complicit in the oppression of both Black and non-Black Palestinians. But again, this is why I want to maybe draw on Syria. So right now in Syria, of course, again, I'm not going to get into, these are, long-winded discussions. One can develop entire courses on them. But very briefly, the power base that exists in Syria, mostly led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, former al-Qaeda, I'm sure you've heard, with regards to Golani and so on and so forth. Okay. Within the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, you have Asian mujahideen. You have all kinds of mujahideen that existed in Syria over the past 14 years. Are they from Syria? No. They have been living there. They have families, they've developed roots, particularly in Idlib, that they had existed within over the past at least 7 to 8 years. You have the Turkish government that is occupying part of Syrian land. You have the Kurdish movements that exist in northeastern Syria. And while, of course, Kurdish people must and deserve a homeland, they have a right of return just as much as Armenians and so on and so forth. But the area in which they exist in Syria is not their homeland. They should be along the Kurdish mountains. They exist in an area and occupying an area, actually, of Syria, in which they're siphoning gas and oil to the Americans. So this question of, again, indigeneity, whose land, and Syrians that have been displaced and who are now returning. We're seeing all the footage that is emerging of Syrians returning from Turkey, going back to Syria, and God bless them, this is their land. But my question is, beyond the fact of anybody's right to return to wherever land, to me, it's all of God's land. This entire earth is God's land. It is sacred that way. But then what are the conditions on which people are returning to those lands? To me, that's the more fundamental question. Because if I go back to Palestine or I go back to Syria and, hey, I want to implement capitalism, and hey, I want to implement an Islamic Sharia or whatever, and quote unquote an Islamic state, as ISIS used to call it, although, like I said, that concept doesn't even exist in Islam, right? Then that becomes a different story. So this is why I talked about the problem of how we organize our society will really determine this question of the right of return, ultimately speaking. Who should be allowed in, and on what conditions people are, if you will, allowed to return and allowed to participate, if you will, in this different kind of world. So to me, that is the more fundamental question. I'm out to build an ummah, for me personally, that it is irrelevant whether you are Muslim or Jew or Christian. To me, this ummah is defined by shared spiritual, ethical, political commitments. Hey, are there not anti-Zionist Jews that are against capitalism, that are against Zionism, that are against nation states? Of course there are. Are there not Christian anarchists? Of course there are. Tolstoy, and so many examples historically, let alone in the contemporary. Are there not Muslim anarchists? Of course. So all these questions allow for a dislodging of the element of identity and a focus on commitments by people who subscribe to the identities, whether you're Palestinian, whether you're Syrian, whether you're Egyptian, and so on and so forth. So to me, that becomes the larger question. Are people willing to take up that responsibility? In a time in which, again, fascism is a mass psychology. Briefly, what I mean by that, well, Egyptians claim that they overcame fear in 2011 with regards to Mubarak. Well, that clearly was not the case. At the end of the day, the Egyptian population is over 120 million. Egypt is the second jailer of peasants. We are complicit in that. What have Egyptians done to the freeing insofar as Palestine and Gaza? If we wanted to march onto Rafah, we could do it. Is the person up above that exists, the dictator that exists in the society, is he going to kill 1 million, 2, 3, 5, 10, 20, 30, 50? Is Palestine not worth that? And again, I definitely believe in avoiding bloodshed, but we need to understand, as Fanon had noted, that decolonization is an inherently violent act. It's violent insofar as because of how we have to reconfigure our own sense of our own being in relationship to land, let alone a relationship to where we are. So I'll stop there because, again, I don't want to digress too much because I'm sure there are other questions as well.
Thank you, Mohammed. I think there's one question here about how international law and these current legal frameworks kind of fit into this conversation. And again, I think you referenced a lot of this colonial legacy already, but expanding, maybe if you could expand on this, because I think international law has been a really important point that people use when they talk about Israel's violations, things like this. And so I think it would be interesting to hear what you think about it.
Abstractly, thank you very much. That's a very important question. Abstractly, it's a very nice concept of international law. But international law was formulated by Euro-American powers. We know the history of the UN and so on and so forth. And their configuration really rests on the humanity of the white European, not on the person of color. And the clear evidence of this is the fact that, well, Israel has been accused of genocide and of massacres. What has the ICC been able to do besides putting out warrants on Netanyahu? Are European powers willing, who created international law, are they willing to subscribe, to follow through? But this is the dual hypocrisy that we witness. People of color are evicted out of international law. Because again, we are not seen, as Gallant had noted, we are human animals. But it's not just him. He learned from his forefathers in the context of America, Again, it is the one leading this war. This is why I continue, and Canada, the same thing. This is why I continue to go back to that arc. Let us look at Canada. Is it not a signatory to international law? Okay. Does international law not define the right of indigenous people to defend themselves? But this is the contradiction of international law, because international law is based on status sovereignty. Meanwhile, it acknowledges the right of indigenous sovereignty so long as it doesn't contradict state sovereignty. Well, isn't that a contradiction? Because how can I say that indigenous people have every right in the context of Canada or the US, that this is their land? The over 500 broken treaties, land that needs to be repatriated. Indigenous people in Canada and the US, as we all should know, are not asking for Europeans or non-Europeans to get on boats and to go back to Europe. They're asking us to respect the covenant and the treaties and the models of governance that traditionally the societies functioned upon. So this becomes the question to me. So international law is very limited, what it can do. We need to come up with a different fabric because, again, it is built on a multicultural liberal order. And of course, liberalism masquerades its Christian, evangelical, European roots. So secularism is a sham that way because it assumes the eviction of religion from politics, which is absolutely not true. Like I said, like we have entire societies built on manifest destiny and doctrines of discovery. The Pope won't even rescind the doctrines of discovery. But what does Canada do? It goes and apologizes to indigenous people. It sends them billions of dollars, and that's about it. But you can never ask for your land back. But land is the true wealth and true capital, as Fanon. It is what gives dignity, what gives respect. It is what defines the public, the private, defines property, what we see, what we touch, and our day-to-day social interactions. So I don't believe, if you will, particularly international law, or at least believe in the fact that it's very, very limited in terms of what it can do. International law could say and has decreed many things over the course of decades. Look at the Golan Heights that are being reoccupied now, etc. International law could claim, well, the Golan Heights do not belong to you. Does Israel and the Zionist entity really care? No. Does America really care? No. Jerusalem is supposed to be a capital for both so-called Israelis and Palestinians. Are we seeing that? No. As whole, it is being sold wholesale to Zionists. And again, this is not out of love for the Zionists. Evangelical Christians that are more Zionist than Zionists themselves are very much spearheading this project. They want to see, we have to understand, this is why I continue to say this is a religious war. Like, we cannot ignore the religious dimension of this war. There's a religious aspect to it. We need to stop being afraid from addressing that. So this is why I keep on saying, give me Isa, who stood alongside Mary. Give me Musa, who stood against Pharaoh. Give me Muhammad. Give me the Quran of the oppressed. Malcolm started a very wonderful project. And the beauty about Malcolm is that he wasn't an ideologist. He was constantly engaged in this process of metamorphosis. The Malcolm before and after, if you will, prison is not the same as the Malcolm before and after the Nation of Islam, the same thing with regards to the Malcolm that came from Mecca. But this is a man whose best friend was, or one of his dearest friends, was a queer black man by the name of James Baldwin. What would Malcolm say about the House of Saudi Arabia now? Given his visit to Mecca, what would he say about Sunni supremacy, Shiite supremacy, about anti-blackness that exists within Arab and Muslim societies? What would he say about queerness and gender? So this is why I've spent my life's work, if you will, to try and continue as much as I can the legacy of the Shining Black Prince to the best extent that I can. Again, and feeding on many other people like Luther King, his message, and so on and so forth. So I know I digressed from the international law question, but yeah.
So related to this, I think someone's also asking about what you think about third world approaches to international law, community, and movement.
The question is a little bit vague because it depends on whether we're talking about statist approaches or third world statist approaches, or whether we're talking about movement approaches. Movements are very different from nation states. They have an effect on nation states, but they're very different from them. So the question is a little bit vague. So unless I get more clarity, which I don't mind at all, obviously, I can address it a little bit more specifically. But again, if international law is useful in any way, it is simply to show the limit. It's sort of like voting. You're showing the limitation of the fact that voting is not a form of harm reduction when we're talking about stolen land. So this is what becomes the question, right? What is the point of having Mansour Abbas or other people in the Israeli Knesset? Well, to legitimize that order, if you will, and to say, well, this is a democratic society. Well, look, we're multicultural or pluralistic, despite the fact that we're engaging again in an active genocide in the West Bank, but Daffa and in Gaza, with regard to the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian people. And this is worse than apartheid. This is why I don't like the comparison with South Africa too much. Yeah, there's apartheid, but this is worse than apartheid for the simple reason that in the case of the Afrikaners, they actually needed Black people in order to till and work the land and as part of the political economy of the apartheid regime. And where is South Africa now? That's a whole different other question, as if South Africa has really achieved independence and liberation and blah, blah, blah. But this is the conundrum. So, but in the context of Palestine, no, Israel wants to completely erase Palestinians. So this is a very different scenario. This is far worse. So, movements are a different story, like I said.
Yeah, thank you so much for that clarification. I think there's a few questions that are very specific in different contexts, like Egypt. So I'll try to like consolidate some of this. I think this one question I think that people might be asking is, and you talked a little bit about commitment and expanding this concept of ummah to be like this inclusive about, responsibilities and commitments. So someone asked, where do we get these commitments that are so needed? Education, grassroots movements. So in terms of these concrete actions of, grounding yourself in those types of commitments, what do they look like to you? And expanding on this concept.
Thank you. So as I say in my book, Islam and Anarchism, Al-Islam wal Sultawiyya, commitments are inherent to our traditions. The whole point of my work is to actually identify, I use the Quran primarily. Of course, all Muslims share the same Quran, whether you're part of the Nation of Islam, whether you're Sunni, Shiite, and Ismaili, and Ahmadi, Sufi, it doesn't matter. Out of the 70, we share that one book. This is why it becomes very important. Of course, we have an oral tradition. And I do use the oral tradition, not the prophetic practice, known as the Sunnah. But to me, the Quran becomes very important because that's the barometer. So when I wrote Islam and Anarchism, I'm going through the Quran. Okay, these are the verses that embody non-capitalist concepts, practices that can act as a foundation for an alternative kind of economy that is more just than capitalism. These are the concepts and practices that define a different way of governance, of political governance, that is not totalitarian, that is not fascistic, that accepts the other, that loves the other, the Christian, the Jew, the Hindu, the this, the that. So long as, again, we share certain ethical and political commitments. It's not just love for the sake of love, right? But rather one that is grounded in a certain praxis. But going through our traditions, concepts and practices that exist within Christianity, that embody an anti-capitalist ethic. And I'm somebody that believes that all forms of social justice are interconnected. You cannot be a Muslim and queerphobic. You cannot be a Muslim and be sexist. There are plenty of Muslims, like I said, that call themselves Muslim and are misogynists, they're sexist, they're Zionists, they're authoritarian, they covet money, they covet power. All that, of course, in all other traditions, Christians, Jews, and so on and so forth. So this is why going back to our spiritual traditions becomes something that's very important in a world in which God has been completely abandoned. But maybe that is part of what the right of return needs to be, that I should not accept, if you will, the institutionalized form of Islam, because Islam was never an institutionalized faith. We don't have a central church. We don't have a central authority as exists within Catholicism. And the same thing, by the way, with regards to Judaism. We've contrived that now. Of course, you have Al-Azhar, etc., as an institution, one of the most preeminent Islamic institution in the world. But people squabble over who owns Islam. Sisi has his understanding of Islam. Al-Azhar has theirs. Muslim Brotherhood has theirs. And again, the Muslim Brotherhood, there are so many different factions within the Muslim Brotherhood. So this is why I'm saying, let us seize back our spiritual traditions in ways that are ethical, political, that are for and grounded in all social justice principles. That you cannot be a true Christian if you are queerophobic. You cannot be a true Christian if at the end of the day you are supporting a Zionist entity. If at the end of the day you don't recognize the fact that you live on stolen land, you benefit from stolen land in the context of Turtle Island. So this is what becomes very important. And we are, again, having done a minor in Jewish studies and so on and so forth, I know all our traditions possess these social justice foundations. So this is what becomes key to me. Insofar as the extracting, we are in a war of, and I hate to frame it this way, but this is the reality, of knowledge and propaganda. So part of that war is developing that Christianity, which again exists. What was Martin Luther King's mission? Let us continue on that. Number two, we need to create alternatives on the land, بدائل على الأرض. Because at the end of the day, if we're looking to convince our communities, our friends, our neighbors, we need to create alternatives on the ground. You see, revolutions involve practical questions. What are you going to do with a nuclear power plant, with the police? Are you going to even have? What are you going to do when a single mother that has 2 kids and is working 3 jobs in order to feed them? How are you going to cater to her? How are you going to provide the conditions such that she becomes genuinely a cared for, let alone contributor to community and to society, as opposed to being strangulated by a 9-to-5 or whatever sets of jobs in order to just simply feed her own kids? There's a verse that Muslims recite and know very well. God does not change a people until they change themselves. Tahrir. And I'll never forget, Egyptians were getting cleaning tools from their homes and literally scrubbing, getting on their hands and knees and scrubbing their streets in Tahrir Square in 2011. For the first time, they felt that, oh, finally, we're returning to our land, not Mubarak's land, but our land. But what happened after those 18 days? Oh, you army, you take over now. Because, you know, we got to go back to work. So all the beautiful innovations, the community councils or neighborhood councils, the Lijan al-Sha'biyya that we had established, the fact that women were, quote unquote, manning checkpoints in Tahrir Square and so on, all went to the fray. Why? Because people didn't embody these principles every single day. When Isa came, when Musa, when Muhammad, it wasn't a one-off thing. Muslims, Jews, Christians needed to know that they needed to change their way of being in the world. The way that we breathe, the way that we eat, the way that we sleep, the way that we conceive of intimacy, the way that we relate to the land. That's the real revolutionary experience. And once you transform of yourself, this is what the verse means, change yourself. Don't point at Mubarak. We all have many Mubaraks and many Obamas and many Trumps that exist inside of us. But how are we going to transform beyond that? Removing a dictator or a ruler. That means we have to change. But people don't want to change. They want to point and say, aha, that needs to be changed. Assad needs to go. Okay, he's gone. And are people willing to change? Are they willing to, do they have an ethics of conflict resolution, of difference, an ethics of hospitality? Do we invite each other to our homes to get to know one another? So that when we do have differences, we have something to fall back on in terms of friendship, in terms of love, a grounded, rooted experience. So this is why I'm saying the creation of alternatives. Zapatistas inspire that. They've created alternative schools, alternative hospitals, and so on. This was the logic of the Muslim Brotherhood when it first emerged in 1929 with Hassan al-Banna. Let us create alternative schools, hospitals, and so on and so forth. For them, a state within the state. We don't want to get into a confrontation with the state. Of course, the Muslim Brotherhood has evolved into various different factions. You have the more militant faction that developed, and that was because of religious repression that came with pan-Arab socialism during the time of Nasser, and so on and so forth. And by the way, like, for example, even a pan-Arab socialist who was an honorable man by him, and not to say that he didn't commit errors, and that's the point. We can't deify anybody. But Nasser displaced Nubians twice. Do they not have a right to return to their lands? So this is the question. But we tend to, like I said, either secularize or romanticize, etc. But we need to then create these alternatives. according to, again, the set of principles that I discussed at the beginning, non-capitalist, non-statist, non-authoritarian principles, and then proceed on from there. So, and there are three types of, if you will, political Islams, very briefly. As I said, the Muslim Brotherhood, when it started, was a state within a state. They didn't want to get into confrontation with the state. By later on in the 60s, 70s, they developed more militant formations. So this is the Qutb angle, or Sayyid Qutb's angle. This is where we see the assassination of Sadat in 79, particularly after how he betrayed Palestine vis-a-vis the Camp David peace accords in 78. And this is where we begin to see a militant kind of Islam emerge. This is the Al-Qaeda, this is the ISIS, and so on and so forth. Though ISIS, like I said, straddles both ends because it tried to develop a proto-state. Hezbollah is a little bit, if you will, in between, insofar as, yes, it's a movement, but at the same time, it has Amal as part of the Lebanese order. But this is why it also had to, with the ceasefire, which I saw as a kind of betrayal of Gaza, because Samahat al-Sheikh was very clear. You want us to stop what is going on insofar as the southern border with you all. The key to this in Gaza. Of course, I don't think Samahat al-Sheikh would be very happy with what is unfolding at the moment. And then you had the third type, if you will, Muslim Brotherhood attempts, which is Turkey, which is the case of Iran. Let us take over the state. These are all Muslim Brotherhood formations. But I'll tell you something more, because this becomes very important for what is coming next. Trump was asked when he came into power, his first trip was in Saudi Arabia. And maybe some of you would remember that dystopian image where he was surrounded by the Arab rulers, Sisi, the Arab monarchies with their Salafi Wahhabi sort of guards, and so on and so forth. And they requested, let us destroy this Muslim Brotherhood once and for all. They weren't referring to the context of the Middle East, because they're already taking care of that. Egypt has already taken care of that, for instance, in this example. They were referring to actually Turtle Island and Europe, because, and this is like an open secret. Layla Ahmed wrote a wonderful book. It's called A Quiet Revolution in 2011, in which she interviewed most Muslim student association organizations that exist on every single campus, just as much as you have Jewish student associations or any kind of, you have MSAs. The foundation of all MSAs here in Europe on every single university campus is Muslim Brotherhood thought. This is not a bad thing, by the way. They range also in spectrum. Some are conservative, some are more queer, feminist friendly, some are a little bit in between. So again, it's a spectrum. CARE, the Islamic Society of North America, all based on Muslim Brotherhood thought. That is what they want to destroy. But now we're seeing, at least in certain areas, Islam and leftists or Muslim leftists fusing together. And this is what, of course, they're very afraid of, because that means that leftists and Muslims are getting together, and a kind of social justice Islam perhaps might be possible. This is why people are very cautious with regards to the events in Syria, and they're waiting with Julani, like, what kind of Islam is he really? And he's been playing the strings very well, according to America and so on. He's learned the lesson. He has a good set of PR agents, if you will. No, women, don't be afraid. We're not going to force you to wear the hijab or to dress this way or to dress that. But this is all like smoke and mirrors. It's all going to collapse, because even if that's not the case, again, he wants power, but Syria is so divided between, again, what is going on in the northeast, between the SAA, the Syrian Arab Army, there's so many different forces that exist on the ground. They do not share a set of value systems, but this is why I'm saying that we need to set our sights on what are our values, what are we fighting against, and what are we fighting for? Are we fighting for a more inclusive Canadian state of indigenous people, but that negates indigenous sovereignty? Are we fighting for a more inclusive Israeli society, but that erases Palestinian sovereignty and Palestinian liberation and self-determination? So what are we fighting for? So I can't understand from people, because people can't tell me what they're fighting against, let alone what they're fighting for. And we could say, well, After Tahrir, we'll decide on the question of how to organize Palestinian society. I'm sorry, the moment will be too gone because there are so many regional, local, and global forces that already have 10, 20, 50, 100 years in advance and are the most organized forces on the ground. The most organized force on the ground is HTS and a bunch of other forces in Syria right now. You think the queer Syrian that is coming, returning to her lands from America or wherever it is, you think she is going to have a place in this new Syria? I really doubt it. What I envision, sadly, and Syria was never a civil war, what I envision, God forbid, and may I be wrong, is either a proxy war or it becomes Libya. And already the Zionists have taken over the Golan Heights. They're 20 kilometers away from Damascus. Who's the loser in all this? But this is because, unfortunately, Arabs and Muslims have been in a state of stagnation, of a lack of ijtihad, of critical reasoning with ourselves and with our traditions for a very long time since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century, 1798.
Yeah, this was a really like powerful discussion, Mohammed. I think there's a few other questions, but I don't think we have enough time for this. But I did put your website in the chat, and maybe one more thing I would like you to speak on, maybe ending on a more hopeful note, is going back to this idea of imagination, which I think is interwoven into your entire discussion, that the imagination of the European Christian has dominated the world, and now what is the imagination of the marginalized and the oppressed. And then if you can speak a little bit on the campaign, I know you emailed me about that would also be,
Yeah.
yeah.
So thank you very much again. I'm really humbled and honored, and I wish we had more time because there clearly is a lot. And I wish we were in the same room because this is precisely what we're talking about. This becomes very important. You know, the eyes are the windows to the soul. That's the only thing I agree with practically Hegel on. But this is where we bear witness to one another and get to know one another and overcome our insecurities, our fears, because we do have internalized stereotypes of one another. This is why I say fascism as a mass psychology. We need to stop lying and deceiving ourselves and say, no, we really don't know Muslims. And we really need to get to know Muslims. But then the question becomes, well, which kind of Muslims? Insofar as the campaign, maybe some of you know, maybe some of you don't. I've been doxxed. I had to leave New York, given the fact that my name came up in the congressional hearings at Columbia University. In fact, I was the second professor that was mentioned on April 17th by Minu Shafiq, who was an Egyptian. This is what I mean, black skin, brown skin, red skin with white masks, right? She was the president of Columbia. She was interrogated by Elise Stefanik, a white supremacist Christian, a congresswoman. And I mean, the story is long, but I got targeted by Elon Musk, half of Trump's administration. Elon Musk, Hegseth, who's going to be most likely the Secretary of Defense, Elise Stefanik, who's going to be the UN representative of the US. So yeah, the Proud Boys had chased me out of New York. Minu Shafiq stated on C-SPAN that I will never be hired in Colombia again. And simply because I wrote a statement on Facebook on October 11th, precisely highlighting this. I do not buy into a world of binaries. My choices will not be, I refuse that my choices be between a Zionist, Wahhabi, crusading Euro-American alliance on the one hand and a totalitarian Russian, Chinese project on the other. Those will not be my choices. I refuse those false choices. I don't buy into a multipolar world. That's a facade. So at the end of the day, she said I was fired. I was never fired. She lied about everything. Of course, what upset them very much was the fact that I'm with the Muqawma that is enshrined in international law. I have the right to say that. Yes, I'm with Hamas and Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad. I'm with that axis, but as I said in the note, I also have strategic differences in values from Islamic Jihad and Hamas and Hezbollah and so on and so forth. Sorry, my Islam cannot be queerphobic. It cannot be sexist. It cannot covet the world of the above. It cannot be hierarchical. Of course, only the first part of the statement was mentioned in Congress, not the rest of my statement. And what really made me public enemy number one, because if you just Google my name, there's tons that will come up, was the fact, not the fact that I was just pro-Palestinian. It was the fact that I was saying that there is no freeing Palestine until we free Turtle Island. And that is what freaked them out. This is when they said he not only wants to destroy Israel, he wants to destroy America. But what they do not understand is that decolonization and abolition are not about destruction. They are about creation. And I've been saying this for decades. There's a difference between mobilization and organization. As Kwame Ture had noted, mobilizing happens around issues. Organizing happens around structures. So Canada is a settler colonial structure. We need to deal, because it can't be a democracy and a settler colonial society at the same time. You can't have both claims. It can't be an American dream and an American nightmare, as Malcolm had called it. You have to choose. It's one or the other. And we need to be brave and courageous to make that choice. So as a consequence, I'm suing Columbia University. I have a lawsuit at present against them. I had to flee Columbia. First, I went to Canada for a little bit. And then after that, I had to return to Egypt looking for work. So yeah, alhamdulillah, it is nothing in comparison to what our siblings in Palestine and Gaza are going through. But yes, this is the campaign. We are Muhammad. Be grateful. If you took it, you can find interviews, you can find the story of what happened and so far as Columbia University. I'm very grateful for the honor of being with my students. It is my students and I were the ones that, alhamdulillah, did the encampment at Columbia. I'm very proud of them. I'm pretty proud of our youth. I'm very proud of, and by the way, this is a product of us just knowing one another in 4 months. And we always joke about it. And we say, well, if we had another year together, can you imagine what we would do? But God bless our youth. Our youth are what political prisoner Mu'mi Abu Jamal referred to. They are our children. They are what come from immortality, and they're the heirs that we shoot towards infinity. I don't have children of my own. God bless you all. You may have children, maybe even grandchildren. I hope to perhaps someday. But my point being is that God bless you all. May you all have a longer life. But at the end of the day, to me, it's not a question of a long life, for me personally, as much as an effective one. And our youth are our promise. And we really need to care for them. We need to protect them. Because the beauty about children is that they see through the truth that we as adults engage in. They can tell when we're being fake. They can tell when we're lying, when we are deceiving them. Or that we're taking things lightly. They're brilliant, they're inquisitive. They're not dogmatic, they're not ideological, they're inquisitive. They're thirsty for knowledge. And I can think of no greater honor than being with my students and playing my role as a knowledge keeper and as a knowledge producer. So please keep me in your prayers that I may see a classroom again, though that is not the only place in which one learns. But inshallah, the Zapatistas have a beautiful saying. Maybe I'll just end on this bright note besides the campaign. They say, they taught me to say that nobody can determine when an uprising or revolution happens, but holding each other's hands, we ask one another what each of us knows. And this is how we discover the revolutionary horizon together. Nobody has all the answers. Islam does not have the answers. Christianity does not have the answers. The Quran says, we created you from different tribes and nations so that you may get to know one another. And the best amongst you are those that exercise piety. Piety. How is piety defined in the Quran? Well, I write about that in the book. Those that subscribe to certain spiritual and ethical commitments, because the term even Muslim in the Quran only appears 5 or 6 times. Do you know what the emphasis is on in the Quran? And Muslims don't even recognize that. The term mu'mineen, believers. So I go through the Quran and I trace, what are the characteristics of the believers? Because that's a general term. And the believer is that who does not corrupt in the earth, who minds the rights of the orphans, the poor, the dispossessed, the wayfarer, the traveler, the one that has no home, the displaced, the migrant, the refugee, who doesn't corrupt in the earth, who doesn't steal the wealth of their kin and their siblings. And so we begin to develop a different cosmology. not only for Muslims, because again, a lot of Muslims may say that they're Muslims, but they're not Muslims in practice. So this is what becomes key to me. Ultimately, beyond that, we are Muhammad. So may we build that, inshallah, different worlds. May we engage in a different kind of hijrah, of a different kind of migration, and a different type of right of return to Creator, because that becomes important. Because as a species, we are very limited in terms of what we can anticipate in advance. People think that revolution is a calculus. It isn't. There are certain things that a revolution requires, yes. But what does God have to teach us? What does non-human life have to teach us about our own petty existence, too, in relationship to creation that is our responsibility, that has been bequeathed to us? That becomes the question. So this is why al-ghaib, or the concept of al-ghaib, even also becomes very important. It's a very important concept in Islam because a lot of verses in the Quran people don't know the meaning of. The second chapter of the Quran begins with 3 Arabic letters conjoined to form an Arabic word that nobody knows the meaning of, alif lam mim. Why is that done? To humble Arabs as to their own existence, their own language. We do not know everything. There are more blank spaces on a page than what's written in black. So let's not educate one another, because that assumes that I'm educating you. That's a noun education. Let's use verbs. We need to learn from one another. That's how I learn from you. You all learn from me. We learn from one another. And this is how we discover. This is how we build a different world together. Again, thank you so much. And I'm so sorry that my responses have been long-winded. Forgive me. My apologies. God bless you all.
Thank you, Mohammed. I think we learned a lot from you today, and it was very insightful. I think thank you for creating this space of imagining and liberation together. And yeah, we are a little bit over time, but I think I did send the link to your website, the We Are Muhammad. So everyone, if you know, can please check this out. We'll also try to put it on our newsletter.
Thank you.
And then we do have actions, but I'll just link it to our website again, kuminow.com/action, so that you know you can visit this, and there's some actions, some based in Advent season where there's Christians that are mobilizing in both in the US and UK for Advent, so that's something that you can join. And then I would like to shout out again that FOSNA has a new campaign where congregations can pair with a Palestinian hostage or detainee within Palestine, and so you can support the family of specific Palestinian detainees. So that's something that you can reach out with FOSNA for, and so that's also on the action page. And then Mohammed, people are also asking if there's any other links to explore your work, whether that be, I think you have.
I'm not much of a social media person, to be quite honest. I do use it. I think you had shared my Twitter, my Instagram. I will share my Facebook as well, though probably I'm least active on Facebook. But please feel free to reach out. The website, when you email it, I will receive the email. I also have a personal website as well. I usually, those go directly to I receive those, whatever correspondence you sent me, through my own personal website, which I'll send you right now. I'll also receive it. I shared my Facebook. And yeah, if you sign up to the We Are Muhammad campaign, you'll get updates about the campaign. You'll see interviews that I've done with the Electronic Intifada, the Red Nation, the Nick Estes, Lakota sibling of mine, if you will, had hosted me on, as well as Jadali and just other forums. So thank you again so much. So
Thank you, Mohammed, for being here today.
the honor is all mine. God bless you all, and happy holidays, everyone. Assalamu alaikum, and may inshallah we see through this coming year, God willing, liberated Turtle Island, liberated Palestine, inshallah. Do not fret and do not lose hope, because our hope is not in one another, I swear to you. Our hope should strictly and only be in God. God is our source of salvation, not human beings. Humans will always fail. Even the best of leaders will always fail. God never fails us. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And yeah, so I have all the links, and I'll stay on a few more minutes in case anyone has questions. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you next week. We actually are talking about the Golan Heights, the Syrian Golan, next week. So yeah, thank you.
Good. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you all.